women were excluded from science, like absolutely, till probably the mid-1900s. The very words that we use to describe nature reflect the exclusion of women for most of the history of systematics and taxonomy.
Now, on behalf of NHM, it is my pleasure to introduce our host and moderator for First Fridays this season, driven by a mission to redefine where science storytelling belongs, and a belief in the power of science to connect people and communities. We are truly fortunate to have as our moderator for another season. Please welcome back neuroscientist and science communicator, Dr. Yewande Pierce.
Thank you, Joel. Always such a warm welcome. Hi, everyone. It's a full house tonight. This is exciting. I hope that you are looking forward to our discussion. I think it's going to be a good one. Before we get into it, though, just a reminder that immediately after this discussion, as Joel mentioned, again, Second Nature will be screening. Our director, Drew Denny, is in the audience. Drew will be on hand to introduce the film and also have a moment to introduce some special guests in the audience. And if you plan on staying for the film, then just stay in your seats after the discussion. And if you plan on going to see the musical performance, you can just exit through the back. So this evening's discussion, sex and gender in nature. So tonight, we aim to dismantle the history, myths, and assumptions surrounding sex, gender, and sexuality in the natural world by delving into the diversity of sexual systems among animals and their revelations about nature's intricate designs. We'll scrutinize the concept of sexual selection, challenge traditional narratives, and consider how scientific inquiry can transcend oppressive ideologies, paving the way towards a future marked by equity and freedom from discrimination for all. So, just a casual, chill Friday night discussion, no biggie. So I'm very, very excited to introduce our guests for the discussion. It's great to have two guests this month. First, please welcome Dr. Ambika Kamath. Dr. Kamath is a writer and scientist, an academic for over a decade. Her research on animal behavior is deeply influenced by intersectional feminist perspectives. Her book, Feminism in the Wild, will be published in spring 2025. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And she is a founding member of Liminal, a science communication collective. Finally, please welcome Dr. Jan Vendetti. Dr. Vendetti is Associate Curator of Malacology, or mollusks, here at Natural History Museum, and is NHM's Twee Bratcher Chair in Malacological Research. We practiced that one before, and I still messed up. She is a founding member of the Urban Nature Research Center, and she's interested in the natural history, evolution, systematics, and conservation of marine and terrestrial snails, an extremely diverse group of organisms, as we'll discover tonight. Thank you both for joining us this evening. Okay, so let's get into it. So I want to start off with just personal journeys and your perspectives on sex, gender, and sexuality in the animal kingdom. I know those definitions can often create some confusion. So you've both dedicated your careers to understanding the natural world and bring very unique perspectives to the field. So before we get into tonight's discussion, I'd love to set the stage by reflecting on your unique paths and how your individual journeys, both inside and outside of the lab, have shaped your current definitions of sex, gender, and sexuality across the animal kingdom. Ambika, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thanks. So my mother was an architect in India in the 80s, 90s, and a woman in a male-dominated field. So from the day I was born, I had this sense that it was possible to push against the status quo, and it was worth doing, even though it was very difficult. And so that was just I think the seed in my mind. And then as an undergrad, I was lucky enough, I had these moments of encountering scientists pushing back against the status quo, and they really stuck with me. So my evolutionary biology professor, she's a queer woman, when she was teaching us sexual selection, she usually would go with the textbook, but had this one slide where she pointed out, like, oh, you should notice that the way that biologists think that males and females behave align perfectly with Victorian stereotypes, and had this image from the era, right? And that stuck with me. I was lucky enough as an undergrad to see talks by Patty Brennan, who some of you met last month, and last month, and Joan Roughgarden. I saw talks by them, and like those really stuck with me. But it wasn't until I was in grad school and studying the social lives of Anolis lizards and started finding that the ways that biologists were talking about them didn't really make sense to me. And that was when I like really got what it really means to push back against the status quo, the visceral experience of it. And so from there, I think I garnered the reputation amongst biologists as someone who thinks about animal sex, but weirdly, and that, like that
is good.
And so I got invited into collaborations on queerness in animals, on these more interdisciplinary collaborations with feminist science studies scholars, and that sort of became my work of integrating critical feminist perspectives into animal behavior science. So like parallel to the scientific journey, also my politics evolved. I started out like from birth a feminist, as pretty much because of my mother, but that feminism grew to become expansive and intersectional, and understanding really that you can't think about any one system of oppression on its own. They all mutually create one another. And then somewhere along the line, I came out as queer, so that sort of started shaping my perspective as well. But most importantly, really, was doing a whole bunch of union organizing as a graduate student and postdoc. And that helped me really understand, how fluid and dynamic our systems can be, and that change is possible if we work together. And that dynamicness and that fluidity has really influenced how I think. It changed completely how I think about nature and the process of science. So,
Thanks.
And just, I guess, to say that that all falls into the definitions that I have of sex, gender, and sexuality as being centered on fluidity and variation first and foremost, and really working hard to reject categorization, which is something we're all so used to doing, is putting things into boxes. It comes almost naturally. It comes sort of effortlessly to us, right? But pushing against that is a huge part of that definition.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that context, having that context early on, is so pivotal in shaping your view and how you define sex, gender, sexuality. But as you said, learning in school these definitions is challenging, because in a way things do need to fit neatly into a box. So Jan, I would love to also hear your story and how you would define those things.
Yeah, so when I was younger, I was interested in invertebrates, and I continued to be interested in them. And when I went to undergrad and then graduate school, in graduate school I worked with a woman who was a malacologist and a paleontologist, so she studied mollusks, fossil and modern. And then when I was in college, as it happens when I look back now, both of my advisors were women, which I had a paleontology advisor and a biology advisor, both were women, and I don't think I intended to do that. I didn't consciously intend to seek out women as role models, but I must have, because there were very few women, so that probably made a difference in shaping my ability to think that I could be a scientist, because it wasn't something that was in my family, but I saw these women doing it, so that was very formative. And then within mollusks, and maybe we will get into this later, mollusks are a really interesting group, so are many, and I think that that's sort of one of the points of this evening, is that many organisms that we think might have a stereotypical or standard sexual system don't necessarily have that, and that is just fascinating and interesting. And so mollusks are interesting in that way regarding sex. And then when I had two more experiences, when I was a postdoc, I was at a postdoc training for postdocs who wanted to do teaching in their professional life, and we were talking about animals, and maybe we'll get into this also this evening, that the scientists in the room, a whole bunch of people with PhDs, kept referring to animals across the tree of life as he, like by default. Everything
all
was
of
a
them. Just
he.
general.
Oh, he, look at him, all snail, bird, mammal, anything. Everything was a he. And I was like, that's weird. Why is everyone doing that? And so we had the last evening that we were there, we could put up criticisms on a Post-it onto a big board, and the TA, who was part of this program, would go through them and address them, anonymously. Like, it was anonymous who said these things, but for transparency's sake, they would go through all of these things. And so I made a comment. Of course, I made a comment, and my comment was, "Don't refer to all animals as he." And this young man saw, and I watched him. I knew what color my Post-it was. I knew what my writing looked like. All these other ones he'd addressed, he'd read, and then read aloud, and then addressed to the group. And he picked up mine, looked at it, crushed it up, and threw it away.
You're joking.
And I was like, what is happening? And so then I was like, is this something I've never noticed before? What is going on? And then I had kids, I had 2 girls, and I read children's books to them, as many parents in the audience did. And I was like, if I see another book with all male characters, and so I started making a list about it. And so now I have a paper that I'm writing about that, about the androcentric bias in children's books in animals. So anyway, this all happened very organically, and I wasn't trying to, I wish I were. I wish I was trying to be, a feminist freedom fighter out there doing the work. And but honestly, I feel like it happened to me. And there were so many instances where I was like, well, why is this way? So anyway, I am now on this path and grateful to do this kind of research.
Thank you both for sharing. I think that sets the scene a little bit, and we'll get more into sort of sex, gender, sexuality, and those differences. And I feel like you sharing the context to kind of how you've come to where you are right now is really helpful, because, of course, sex characteristics, male and female, as we'll find, are not that straightforward. And this is all about kind of undoing the idea of binaries. So appreciate you sharing a bit about that. So I wanted to move on to diversity beyond binaries. So sex, gender, and sexuality will probably be the only thing that we try to separate during this conversation, because as Joan Roughgarden explores in her book, Evolution's Rainbow, which challenges us to view life on Earth through a non-binary lens, there's so much diversity in nature that, thinking in generalizations just doesn't seem appropriate, or maybe even impossible now. So I would be interested if you could share examples from your own research about that fluidity and diversity of nature. Jen, would you like to start?
Yeah, so one way that I think of it, and not everybody sees it this way, even within biology, but I do think of a binary in gametes. So in animals, there is a gamete binary. There are eggs and sperm, and then how that manifests in phenotype is highly variable, but usually egg-producing organisms are called female, or they're called female if they have the potential to, or at that moment are able to produce eggs, and males have the ability to produce sperm, and those are 2 very different gametes, right? Sperm are small and motile, and eggs are larger and static and don't move very much, and within mollusks, there are organisms that are clearly binary in that sense. There are males and females, and there is no in between. And then in biology, we call that hermaphrodism. So I'm just going to show you some examples. Can I go ahead and do that?
I would love to.
So I brought some specimens.
I think everyone's wondering what these are.
So we are at a museum. So these are specimens from just upstairs in malacology. So this one, does anyone know what this is? I know it may be hard for those in the back to see it. It's a paper nautilus, so I'll use the mic so you can hear. So it's not paper. It's a very thin material that only the female makes. So this is a female octopus egg case. So imagine the octopus is about the size of my hand, and it's a female. She swims around. These are octopods or octopuses that never touch the seafloor. So they are swimming their entire lives, which is not what we usually think of when we think of an octopus, right? Diversity. So it's swimming its entire life, and it mates with a male, and the male is about the size of maybe the first unit of my pinky finger.
Oh, wow.
So it's a situation where the males are called diminutive males.
Oh, really?
They're very tiny males.
Diminutive
And that's
males.
also, and this shouldn't be this way, but it's counter to what a lot of people think of as the dimorphism between males and females, that males are big. We're in a mammal hall, right? There's many big, giant mammals, mammal males. That's not the case in all animals, and certainly not in all mollusks. So anyway, this female swims along and mates with this diminutive male, and then she has to lay her eggs somewhere, but she has no like rock to put them on. So she creates this pouch out of chitinous material, carries it around, swims with her other 6 arms, and it puts her eggs in here. They hatch out, they swim away as little octopods. She lets this go, probably dies, and this somehow floats up on a beach somewhere, and then we get it, if we're lucky, at the museum. This is Otala lactea in Los Angeles. There are at least a dozen localities where this introduced species from Spain lives. This snail has male and female reproductive parts, so it's an introduced species. It's not yet necessarily invasive, but one of the things that can be really helpful for a new species in a place where it's not native is if both partners after mating can go off and lay eggs, because you don't have one partner who cannot, like a male. So both these individuals after they mate can go off and lay eggs, so that's why their populations get really big so fast. So these are all around us in Los Angeles. Both, yes, both reproductive. This next species, these are Crepidula slipper limpets, and they make these mating stacks. The individuals on the bottom are usually larger, and they're female, and the smaller individuals on the top of this mating stack, much of their life is just like this, are males, and they'll change sex throughout their life depending on where they are in this stack. So they can change from making sperm and making eggs, and they broadcast spawn, so they send that sperm and egg out into the water. And then one more.
One more. And also I'm interested, I just want to tap.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's very different. Do you want to try, Ambika?
So this is an oyster. It's an unusual oyster. We don't have these oysters in California. And oysters almost all oysters start out as male and become female later in their life.
That's beautiful. That's stunning. So,
That's what I've got.
It's incredible that you have all of these. Thank you for sharing that. So, what this really displays is that there is so much diversity within within mollusks, and so you have the intersex, you have like the binary. You do have some that do adhere to the binary, but there is a lot more diversity.
Right.
So the discovery, I'm going to test you here, but the discovery of these different examples that we've just seen, is that more recent or?
I think no. For the paper nautilus, people didn't know what that was for since ancient times. Like they're also called Argonauts. So there's a history of them for possibly thousands of years, and people didn't know how they reproduced. An octopus, a male has an arm called a hectocotylus, and that arm is the spermatophore-bearing arm, and he will detach it inside the body of a female, and people didn't know what it was. They thought there was always like, why do we find these octopus with worms in them? But it wasn't that, it was the reproductive part of the male. So a lot of it was, I guess if you expect there to be a certain sexual system and your mind isn't open to thinking, observing as a scientist, truly observing as a scientist and being objective, if you're expecting a certain sexual system and you don't see it, then it's a mystery. We don't understand how this works, but maybe if you were to look at it more carefully and just be open to this sexual system might be very different than anything we're used to or we've seen before.
Absolutely.
And so the rest of them I don't know when their sexual systems were discovered, but I think once people got the hint that mollusks were different than, say, mammals, and that invertebrates in general have very interesting sexual systems sometimes, then it was just, it was par for the course.
That's a fascinating point, because if you think of these, it can be dismissed so often as an anomaly or an artifact.
Yeah, right.
But
Right. No, yeah, that's right.
Ambika, I would love to hear your take on some examples from your own research about the fluidity and that diversity that we've been speaking about a little bit.
I love that Jan grounded us in these real examples because I'm going to pull us all the way into abstraction on the other side. But essentially, I love these examples of specific species that are all diverse when you look at them in this is bad. When you look at them in totality. But what I want to point out is that you can look at any population of animals, right? Any group of animals that are doing a thing, that are behaving in some way, and you can focus on what makes them similar, or you can focus on what makes them different. And in science, we are very much acculturated to focusing on the patterns, focusing on what's similar. And then that really tends to it sort of makes it hard to look at variation. It makes it hard to see variation for what it is. You just alluded to this. We start to look at at variation that doesn't fit into the pattern that we expect to see as an exception, as an anomaly. And that is so prevalent in research on animal sex and sexuality in particular. So Bruce Bagamiel in the 90s wrote this beautiful book called Biological Exuberance that it's like 700 pages cataloging queerness in animals in all kinds of different ways, right? And he points out in that book this attitude that biologists have often had of sort of seeing queer sex as anything but sex, right? You start to think of all of the other reasons that it might, like, maybe it's just a dominance thing, maybe it's just like how they greet each other, maybe it's just like practice for the real thing later on.
What are they doing?
And that tendency to sort of not see the variation for what it is especially pervasive. And like the focus that we have in science of thinking about patterns, sort of, it has this unfortunate result that you can then also use it to only look for what you expect and not look sort of more openly, right? So where I think I love these examples of species that are different than what we expect, but I also want to point out that within species, within populations, one should start to expect variation, right? So in lizards, which are the organisms that I've worked with the most, like there's a very famous example of the whiptails, which are these all-female parthenogenetic, which means that they produce babies without having sex, sort of asexual lizards. But then also, but what's cool about them is that even though they don't need to have sex, there are no males to reproduce, the females still sort of engage in courtship and mounting sex essentially with one another, and individuals that do engage in sex do end up producing more babies, even though it's not actually necessary for reproduction.
So even without the necessity of the reproduction, they still engage.
Yeah, and so like that's a sort of example that you simply cannot ignore, right? Like you cannot look at that and say, oh, that must be for something else. But within a species, the lizards that I worked on, for example, Anolis lizards, best studied lizards probably on the planet, we know for a fact that males have sex with one another in that species, and that's about it. That's all we know. We know what happens, right?
Just observed.
Just observed. It's been observed. People have tried to shove it under the rug. But even in the most well-studied species, if we can say, oh, most of the time they're having sort of heterosexual sex, then we don't need to think about the queer sex that's also happening. So what my hope for really for the field is not to like move away from thinking of these instances within populations as anomalies or exceptions, and really sort of allowing queer perspectives to shift the expectation for what we expect, for what variation would look like.
Thanks, Ambika. And I think you've both given examples of mollusks. Jan and Ambika, you've been talking about lizards, but that variation that we see within a species is like a lot broader than that. Outside of those two examples, we'll get into it more, but do you see something similar, for example, with the females being able to reproduce without a partner? Are there other examples?
I think that happens in fish a lot. Yeah. Fish hybridize a lot, and often when you have hybridization, you end up changing in sexual systems. And if you look just at examples of same-sex sexual behavior, as biologists like to call it, you see that everywhere, all over the place. Yeah. Like there are thousands of species in which it's been documented, right? But going beyond that documentation has been hard for the field. Like we know it exists, what next?
What next? Thank you, that was really insightful. So I think this kind of transitions into a really important topic, which is rethinking sexual selection, which is an area of science that is undergoing a little bit of change, but I think it's a really good opportunity to talk about it here. So, starting sentences with Charles Darwin said does tend to give people a lot of pause, but I do think that we have this really good opportunity now to unpack it a little bit. So here goes. So Charles Darwin suggested that traits that increase an individual's reproductive success sometimes evolve even at the expense of their survival, and noted that sexual selection depends on the struggle between males to access females. So how has your understanding of this concept evolved to incorporate a broader view of gender and sexual behavior in the natural world? Jan, I'd love to hear your take, because you do a lot of teaching, and these textbooks have existed for years, so I'm really curious as to how you kind of navigate that.
Yeah, I teach evolution for non-majors at a community college, so I have a lot of students who are unfamiliar with the concepts of evolution entirely. So it's I really get to start from scratch, and they ask really good questions that I think sometimes biology majors wouldn't ask, because they've already been through. They're like, oh, I know what I'm supposed to ask or supposed to think about this. So I love teaching sexual selection. Like, I absolutely love it, and I use the peacock and the peahen as an example, which is a very textbook example, and the way that I teach it, I find the whole subject fascinating, and I hope that my students do. And the way that I like to, I show a picture of a peacock from Arcadia, because they're all over Arcadia. So I take my own photos of those peacocks and peahens. Anyway, so I show peacock in full regalia displaying. And I'll say to my students, you know, this is beautiful and lovely, and first of all, this is the peacock, and that's the male, and the peahen has a name, and her name is a peahen, and together they are called peafowl. But anyway, the peacock, one way to think of it is the peacock looks that way because the peahen likes it that way. Mm-hmm. Like, the peahen is choosing males, and this is the female choice part of sexual selection, and there's several other ways that this has been sort of sliced and diced to understand why there's certain sexual systems. And the peahen making these choices influences the phenotype of her sons and the predilection for those characteristics in males in her daughters. And my students find it really interesting, and like I said, I find it fascinating. And what you just said about Darwin that I do appreciate is that he figured out that, and others probably did too, I tell my students all the time, but he's the person who wrote it down in English-speaking world, and that's what we've got. So anyway, his characterization of it, that females are choosing these males, and the males in this case are really not very well suited for living when they have these huge tails. Like they're very lovely, they're very beautiful, but I'll say, like, think about how easy it is to fly up in a tree with that huge tail. And think about how you're going to get eaten by something when you've got this whole nonsense trailing behind you most of the time. And then I show a picture of the peahen, and I'm like, she is sensibly dressed. She's got she blends into her surroundings in the wilds of Arcadia, and she's going to live forever, right? And here's this dapper gentleman, and he is not going to live very long. And so we talk about all those dynamics. And so that part of sexual selection, I really do appreciate. I think that things can sort of go off the rails a little bit when there are expectations of gender in animals. Mm-hmm. And then that's the part where I get, where the gendered part makes me upset, because to me, there's sex in animals, and gender is something that we add on as expectations of behavior. But they have evolved to behave how they behave. And that, to me, is expressions of their sex, which I guess someone would call gender, but I wouldn't. I wouldn't do that. I would say this is how this sex behaves. And then, to your point, there is variation, right? There's quite a lot of variation within species, some species about that. So on the whole, I appreciate and I enjoy teaching sexual selection, and I enjoy thinking about it as a non-adaptive way to have interesting traits. But I know that there are other perspectives.
Yeah, thank you, Jan. And I'm glad that you brought up the sex, gender in animals, because you can't really communicate with the animals and ask them what their gender expression is, but they are gendered, and there are behaviors that are associated with specific. So that in itself is complex, and I think Ambika, you'll have some things to add to that. But I appreciate, the focus as well for females having more autonomy within nature and actually turning the perspective is really important and really key. Ambika, I'd love to hear your take on that question.
Just jumping off of what Jan said about female choice, Darwin did propose female choice as a mechanism by which sexual selection could happen. But then biologists did not take that very seriously simply because they assumed that females would not have the cognitive capacity to perform choices like that. So for the longest time, that wasn't really taken seriously within biological circles, except for one exception that we'll get to in a second. So unlike Jan, I hate teaching sexual selection. It stresses me out, and it stresses me out for two reasons. First of all, I feel like, okay, there's two things. One is, what is it missing? Mm-hmm. And then the second part is, what was done with the concept after Darwin proposed it? And so the first thing that is missing from the sense of sexual selection, which is, let's take either female choice or male-male competition, which is the other main way that sexual selection happens, is there's this sense that the males that reproduce, or the males that are chosen, are the best, right? The most aggressive, the most attractive, the most good at maybe in the rare occasion rearing offspring or something, right? Like there is this sense of like there is a way to be the best at something, and that is what is selected for. And what that is discounting is the tremendous variation that you see across populations, across individuals, through time, in variation in mate choice. Over and over again, scientists have found that females do not consistently choose the same kinds of males. Mm-hmm. There is variation in all of these traits that does not get accounted for in this schema. Right?
And that's within a species.
Within a
different
species.
Females
Yeah,
within
different females within a
species
species don't always make the same choices. And so my favorite example of this is these beautiful birds called Lansdale manakins. They're these little blue and red and black birds in Panama. Males pair up and do these very delightful jumping and trilling displays to one another. You've seen that? There's a live webcam on them now. It's great. And Emily Duval has been studying these for 2.5 decades, and she has been looking and looking and looking to figure out what females choose. And all she finds is variation. And this is the sort of thing, again, like coming back to like whether do you focus on the pattern or do you focus on the variation, right? You study a population once, maybe you find a pattern, you come back to that same population again, it might be different, but that's going to be a lot harder to publish about once you've sort of said, oh, this is how sexual selection is working, right? Okay, so the thing that's missing is variation. And then the second thing is, so who were the people, what happened to sexual selection theory after Darwin proposed it? What happened to it was taken up by eugenicists. So eugenics was a scientific enterprise in the sort of late 1800s, early 1900s, through the 1920s and 30s, and people like Ronald Fisher, Charles Darwin's own son, Leonard Darwin, was president of the Eugenics Education Association or some organization like that. But Ronald Fisher, who was the person who really took up sexual selection theory, was really invested in making human populations better. By better, he meant more white, more like rich people, more straight, more cis, less disabled, and doing this in a way that was through controlling reproduction, right? And so he was invested in sexual selection theory and developing out that theory as a scientific backing for his and his colleagues' eugenic proposals. And so the whole, if you thought, and so the sense that, if you talk about what's known as positive eugenics, that's when you're sort of encouraging females, women in this context, to make choices about who they're mating with, who they're choosing to marry, who they're having children with, that align with the direction that you want the human population to go in, right? That these eugenicists want the human population to go in. And the theories of sexual selection were developed to be able to sort of provide scientific backing to that. The whole time in general, the first half of the 1900s was a time when scientists were unabashed about using their science to political ends. So it sort of fit in with that, but those are the same theories that we're using right now, right? And that, I think, should really give us pause. And what I find, again, beautiful, coming back to that Lansdale mannequin example and Emily Duval's research, is we don't have to do that. We can stretch ourselves to think about mate choice in different ways. So Emily and some of her colleagues have just put out this awesome model that doesn't depend on eugenics at all. It's a way of thinking about mate choice. It leads to the expected result is variation, right? We can think differently, we just have to choose to do so. And this is unfortunately stuff that I haven't yet figured out how to teach.
I mean, thank you, Ambika, for that. The next question I want to move on to is actually about how this relates to us. But I think that you raise a really important point. I think science does have a history of, in this space, of being kind of corrective. The focus is to correct, to fix things. Jan, I'd love to hear your response to that and kind of how you take the way that we humans take the science and then it gets skewed in this way, or it gets politicized. Intersectionality is some of the things that I know, Ambika, you've spoken about, and it does belong in that conversation. But I'm wondering about how the two begin to fit together to move us forward into space. So we're still focusing on what's happening in the animal kingdom, but we are not taking for granted that we are humans and we bring in all of this extra baggage.
Yeah, well, I think one thing I could start with that, just on the heels of what we were just talking about, is the gendering animals. It doesn't allow us to see and this is me getting all sentimental about nature, but it doesn't allow us to see the beauty of what has evolved as it is, and that should be enough. So for example, in the peafowl example, one of my kids used to get a kids magazine, and in it there were always cartoon depictions of animals doing things. And one of them, and I flagged it because I did, but one of them had peacocks, the males, showing off their tails, and they had big eyelashes, and they were wearing feminine clothing. So I looked at that and I was like, what? So what it reflected to me was that we, or the illustrator and the editor and whoever else at this children's magazine, was deciding that these beautiful things in nature, these beautiful animals, this must be the female. The one that's pretty must be the female. And so they depicted it that way. And this was over and over in several examples. Yeah. And this is to kids. So kids are getting, there may be bigger problems in the world, but this is one issue where these kids are getting this, that's where it starts, right? Why did that guy grab my Post-it and crumple it up? Because it's to many of us, in at least English-speaking, I'll speak for English-speaking North American people, that it is probably baked in. It is probably something that is so ingrained in us that we don't even think about alternatives, or wait a second, no, that's the male, and think about. And so this is why I enjoy parts of sexual selection, because when I teach it, I get to turn the tables a bit on my students and say, no, this is how this system evolved, and it's very different than what we do. And anyway, so that's one thing. So I think it's very limiting to think about gendered animals. And another example, and you probably all know this, when people talk about cats, do you think male or female? Maybe you don't. You're an enlightened audience. I shouldn't be asking you. So many people say, well, dogs are male and cats are female. It's just that's kind of the way to think about that. Obviously they're not. Obviously there's 50%, right? But that if you were to say what characteristics, that's gendering an animal. And this is the same for a T-Rex. There's a children's book in our local library called She-Rex. Makes me livid. Why isn't it
here?
No. I'm sorry, library in Los Angeles. Sorry, not here. But it's about isn't this funny? This T-Rex is female. And I'm thinking to myself, no, this is a vertebrate. Half of all T-Rexes were female. What are we doing? Why is this a big surprise? And of course she was wearing pink and a dress, and so I think that it is terribly limiting, and it influences children and the way we grow up and the way we internalize gender roles and being gendered. And so that's one. And then the other thing is I did a small study of species names. So I have an interest in taxonomy and systematics and Latin scientific names. And you all are probably familiar with some. There's gender in Latin. I'm not going to go into all of that, but there are species that are named after people, and they are called eponyms. Sometimes they're called patronyms, but that's inherently sexist. So eponyms is they're named after humans. And an eponym, if it ends in an I, so like I study a species, the species name is Taylori. It's named after a man and whose name was Taylor. So it's Taylor I with an I. And if it's named after a woman or a girl or a female, it is AE at the end. So it would have been Taylor A if it was named after a woman with the last name Taylor. And I looked at mollusks, that's what I study, and I looked at about 5,000 species names. And of those that were eponyms, 90% were named after men and 10% were named after women.
Wow.
And
90.
so this is and the way that I explained it to myself and in this paper was that women were excluded from science, like absolutely dramatically excluded from science in the Western world. And elsewhere this is different, but I'm just speaking of the English-speaking Western world, excluded until probably the mid-1900s. And there were a few women who did work prior to that. Like if any of you are paleontologists, you'll know like Mary Anning. But there's like, why do we all know Mary Anning? Because there was just her. It was really just her.
She's the famous one.
There's that one. So there are very few women. So there were very few people for men who were doing the taxonomy and systematics to name species after. Right? Their advisors weren't women. Most of their colleagues were not women. Their mothers and daughters and sisters, et cetera, were women, but they didn't name species generally after them. And when they did, that was only 10%. So the very words that we use to describe nature reflect the exclusion of women for most of the history of systematics and taxonomy. So it's I think a reminder that we don't have to get all bummed out about necessarily, because it is a bummer, but we can look at that and just recognize that this was the history of this field. It is not, and it does not have to be anymore, but it certainly is a reminder that it was quite exclusionary until quite recently.
Yeah, and I think it starts with that acknowledgement and actually recognizing that, and then you can move past it. Yeah. And I love where we've gotten to. We have so many people in the audience, so I'm sure have a ton of questions, so we'll go to Q&A shortly. But this has brought us into gender bias within doing this research, and you've both highlighted the importance of the scientists doing science. Science is meant to be impartial, but scientists themselves are embedded in a social and cultural context that subjects them to the risk of gender bias assumptions. As conscious as you're trying to be, it's going to happen. So thank you for kind of making those points about that 90% animals named men, and also Amber, I'm going to plug your book again, Feminism in the Wild. I know really goes into that. And all of this, we focus on these different examples within the animal kingdom, I think has the power to tell us something about ourselves, whilst also, as you said, Jan, recognizing the beauty in just allowing nature to be nature. And we don't necessarily have to make it fit into our own constraints or tell us too much about us. But we are kind of coming up on time, so I do want to ask the audience a few questions. But thank you so much for the discussion so far. So we'd like to hear your questions. The Natural History Museum staff are going to come around with a microphone. So if you just raise your hand, they'll come and find you. And then we'll start taking your questions. One on the right. Okay, over here.
Oh, perfect. Hey, this is probably most relevant to Jan with her community college classes, but I'm quite curious if you're seeing younger generations that are interested in the sciences already coming into it with more understanding of the dynamics of gender. versus some of the older generations, or is this something that still is just like all young people are starting at the same base that we've seen with the latter generations?
Interesting question.
I would like to say that the younger folks are paving a new path. They might be. They really might be. I think that there's a different perspective among some young people about sex and gender and what they should look like or can look like. I haven't seen it in my students in a way that is a dramatic difference from what I'm used to seeing. That doesn't mean it's not there. I do think, though, when I sent my paper about eponyms that I was just describing, when I sent it to my previous college and PhD advisors, both of them women, I never thought about that.
Oh, wow.
Never thought about that. They're in their late 60s and late 70s. And they were paving the way for women in science. And they never thought about that. So I think that there's a lot of work to do, clearly. And I do hope that the younger generation is maybe more open to seeing things differently than and ready to kind of get rid of some of the stereotypes about sex and gender, and they can make their science better for that. I hope that's the case.
Thanks, Jan.
Well, first, thank you so much for making time to talk to us and share more about queerness in science and biology. I guess my question was, do either of your research studies or papers touch on biological variation in humans regarding sex? Since I know in sex and gender class I took in college, I learned more about how when babies are born, sometimes their genitalia can, be in the gray zone of what we consider heteronormative. Mm-hmm. And I'm just kind of curious if there's studies about the advantages of having that sort of variation, or just in general, the topic isn't very discussed, but I think it's quite interesting.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I was hoping someone would ask that because we were short on time, but Lessons from the Wild is something that, I would love to hear your answers for. Ambika?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's a good opportunity for us to touch on the sex binary too. And this is a place where there's tremendous disagreement across biologists and growing. Like, this is probably one of the most rapidly changing bits of biology at the moment, is how we're thinking collectively about sex binaries. And again, like, this emphasis that I've been trying to put on variation, I feel like is instructive here, which is, so when we think about, we argue a lot about what sex means, right? Like, how it is that we actually identify sex. And if you push a biologist, they'll come down to, like, yes, it's the gametes, right? It's the egg and the sperm. But when we realistically are assigning sex to, like, if you put a specimen of something in front of me, or like I see an animal out in the wild, am I looking at its gametes? No, I am not, right? I am not almost ever looking at that animal's gametes. I am inferring what its gametes are based on all of this whole other suite of characteristics, right? What it looks like, what its genitalia like, what color its feathers are, how big it is, what its chromosomes might be, what hormones it might have, like this, how it might be behaving. And that whole confluence of traits gets put in these two buckets of male and female, right? And that is what prevents us from being able to see all of this variation, right? Imagine, like, and so those of us that are sort of arguing that it's not just the gender binary that we need to question, but also the sex binary in humans and other animals. And hopefully this answer will speak to your question about humans in particular, but this is a question that we're considering across the board. Like, what we're suggesting instead is that because those associations that we're so, again, a culture to putting into these two binary buckets of male and female, when those associations between that whole complex of traits, gonads, gametes, hormones, behaviors, appearance, all of that, when you start to tease them apart and really look at that variation, it gets so fuzzy that it makes it sort of almost a hindrance to think of it as binary. So I'll give an example of, this is a classic example of what's called sex role reverse species, right? Where you've got jacanas, which are, they're this bird from Panama, Central America, yeah. And they, so you've got males and females, but then males behave like females, but then they produce these other gametes. And then if you look at their hormones are fluctuating. When they're behaving in one way, they have one kind of hormone profile, and when they're behaving another way, they have another kind of hormone profile. And so scientists are sort of working really hard to sort of say, okay, they're males and females, but then their sex role reversed at these times, and then they're not, they're behaving like their sex is supposed to at these other times. And you look at that and you're like, why are we insisting on holding on to these two buckets, right? Set the buckets aside and just look at what they're doing. Look at the variation in all of those traits for what it is in that species, in that context, right? And so that's sort of, that is one way of thinking about variation, and intersex variation would fall into that, right? Like, yes, people have genitalia that don't fall into those two buckets. That's okay. What does that mean for the rest of their lives? What does that mean for hormones? What does that mean for producing babies? What does that mean for all of these other things? It doesn't have to be a problem because it doesn't fit into the binary box.
Thanks, Ambika. I think that answers it really well, because this idea of you might start with a binary on the gamete level, but then there's so much else, really, I think, does provide a new way of thinking about not just gender binary, but sex binaries. And so I know gender is a social construct, but I've heard as well that we're beginning to think that maybe sex is also a social construct.
Right.
But thank you for that answer. That was great. Are there any other questions?
And this will be our last question.
Hi, I know you guys have talked a lot about sex, sexuality, and gender within the animal kingdom. I was just wondering if you guys had anything to say about that kind of research within other organisms, so within plants or mushrooms or prokaryotes, whatever.
Good question, thank you. Jam, would you like to take that one first?
Yeah, so the sexual systems in, I think about mollusks most of the time, but there's sex and other things, and in fungus and in bacteria, right? In bacteria, there's conjugation. We don't, if you remember from intro bio, right? There's the exchange of genetic material, but it's not really called sex. In fungus, they have gametes that are, well, they don't really have, do they have? Yes, they do. They have gametes, but they're not different sizes, so they're anisogamous instead of, no, they're isogamous. They have same shaped and sized gametes, which is a very different system than an egg and sperm system. I think, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question at all, but I think that the diversity in sexual systems is something that we should be in awe of across all of life that has evolved. There are all of these different ways for organisms to share and exchange and shuffle their genetic material for the potential betterment of the next generation through natural selection and whatnot. That there is to create variation. There are these different ways of exchanging genetic material, and it's not all sexual systems. So I think I just sort of contradicted myself. I think I called them sexual systems, but sometimes they're not even called that. Exchange systems, genetic exchange systems, that's not that doesn't come out very nicely, does it? But that's, but there are these different ways of exchanging genetic material that have evolved independently across all of these lineages of life. And that, someone who studied just that, I mean, we all have to become specialists in something, but I would love to read something or hear a talk of somebody who is just giving a survey of, here is how all of life, all of these different lineages of life do this. And just sit back and try to make sense of that. And I don't know how to make sense of it. It's just amazing. Do you want to chime in?
Do you have anything to add?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I studied plant sex systems as an undergrad, and so it was this really nice respite from animal behavior. And it's really cool because so often most flowering plants have produce both pollen and eggs, right? And so plant biologists tend to think about sex from male to female already on a spectrum, because every individual flower, every individual plant can have like different amounts of reproduction through pollen and through eggs, right? So in those classic biological ways, the male function and female function can slide on a spectrum. So that, I think, at the heart of that, like, already leads plant biologists to think much more fluidly in some ways about sex, but in other ways, they like, for example, use the word gender to describe, I can't remember exactly what, which is embarrassing since I studied this, but it was 15 years ago. But like, they use the word gender. They have sort of rigid, in some ways sort of other, I guess what I'm trying to say is, different biologists studying different creatures look at these sexual systems in very different ways too. And we can learn a lot from each other, amongst biologists studying different kinds of organisms, about how to think about sex and gender. And like, in some ways, the plant biologists are thinking more radically about sex and gender than animal biologists are, and in other ways, maybe it's the opposite, because I think animal biologists are pulled along more by radical thought in humans. So yeah, I think there's, as Jan was saying, there's a lot to learn from stepping back and looking at it all at once.
Thanks, Ambika. And I think to wrap up from this discussion, it seems so much like the more you're willing to see, the more you see. And I love that question about plants, because it really does bring that into the conversation. And I know that we want to relate everything back to us, but I think we can learn a lot. And in the end, it's scientists like the both of you that help us to widen our perspective and change how we're doing this science. So thank you so much for this discussion. A big round of applause. Thank you.